So today I'm going to talk about fueling a transition to a cleaner transportation future. But I want to start by saying a few words about the organization that I represent, the Clean Vehicles Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And when we think about what we're trying to accomplish broadly, we think about a plan to cut projected oil use in half over the next 20 years. And to do that, we need to move forward aggressively on efficiency and innovation in all of our uses of oil. And so to say a couple words about what that means, when we think about efficiency, we're thinking about the miles per gallon that cars and trucks that we all drive get. And there's encouraging news to report in that regard. In the last 5 years, the efficiency of new cars and trucks has increased by about 5 miles a gallon. And that's after several decades in which there's really not seen much progress in that area. And if you compare that to the target for 2025, you see that this the progress we've seen in the last 5 years is exactly what it's going to take to deliver on this 2025 goal, and that's consistent with our broader half the oil plan. And of course, we need to improve the efficiency not just of the cars and trucks we drive, but of the vehicles that move our freight, airplanes, boats and trains, the whole transportation sector, and even uses of oil outside of the transportation sector. And so efficiency is really where it all starts, and it's tremendously important. But we can't get all the way to our half the oil goals with efficiency alone. We also need innovation. Innovation in terms of new, cleaner fuels, like using electricity as a transportation fuel, next generation biofuels, and also innovative new ways of doing business that reduce our demand for oil. And so when we do all of these things, we can cut projected oil use in half. And of course, it stands to reason that when we cut our oil use, we also reduce all the problems that oil causes for our economy, for our security, for the environment, and perhaps most fundamentally, for the climate. And so, that's our half the oil plan. But today, I'm going to focus a little more narrowly on fuel. And so today, I'm going to talk about electricity as a transportation fuel, and then I'm going to talk about biofuels, and finally, I'll talk about oil, and then conclude with some summary comments. So when we think about electricity as a transportation fuel, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, people in my organization, clean transportation experts generally, are very look forward to a very big role for electricity as a transportation fuel. And of course, when you use a car that's powered by electricity, you're not using oil, and so that's great towards meeting our oil goals. But it doesn't mean that that electricity has no emissions associated with it, or that it doesn't take any fuel to power these vehicles. It just means that when we want to understand the emissions associated with driving an electric vehicle, we have to look, not at the vehicle's tailpipe, but we have to follow this orange cord into the house and think about, where does that electricity come from? And so if you think about the nation as a whole, about half of the electricity comes from coal, about 20% from natural gas, about 20% from nuclear energy, and about 10% from renewables. But we actually don't power up our cars on a national grid. The grid is broken down into regions, and each region has a different mix of resources. And so, in this north central region, as one sort of extreme example, coal is a predominant source of electricity. And by contrast, if you go west of there, we have a lot of renewables providing more than half of the electricity. And so, that makes a big difference in how clean an electric vehicle is, depending on where it's charged up. And so if we want to convert this to units we're more familiar with for cars, sort of a mile per gallon unit, if we look at the total carbon pollution associated with driving a vehicle in either of these regions, what we see is that in this north central region, the efficiency is about 37 miles a gallon, and that's pretty good. That's better than an average gasoline-powered car. But there are some of the most efficient cars, especially hybrids, that are cleaner. But in regions where the grid has a higher share of renewables, then driving an electric vehicle is by far the cleanest choice on the road, definitely the best choice there. And so if we kind of fill out the rest of the country with these same figures, what you see is that even in the coal-heavy parts of the grid, driving an electric vehicle is a good choice and is cleaner than an average car. But in about in the cleaner sections of the grid that we've marked in this light blue called BEST, driving an electric vehicle is the cleanest, lowest carbon pollution vehicles on the road. But so electricity doesn't just vary across space, our electricity grid. It also varies across time. Our grid is changing. Just in the last 4 years, the share of electricity produced from coal has dropped significantly, with a significant increase in renewables and a big increase especially in natural gas as a source of electricity. And if we sort of just project forward on a business as usual basis to 2050, we expect to see the same trends continue. Natural gas grow, coal shrink, and renewable energy also continue to rise. And this seems like it would be moving in the right direction, but it's actually not going to get us where we need to go. Because if we look at the total carbon emissions associated with this future, it drops a little bit, but it doesn't drop anywhere near as much as we need to respond to climate change. So if we look at an alternative scenario that makes more sense, it really does respond to climate change, we need to have a much bigger role for renewables and phase out coal even more quickly. And still a significant role for natural gas, but not as large a role as in the other scenario. And so if we take this path, we really can make cuts in carbon pollution that we need to respond to climate change. And if you think about what this means for an electric vehicle that's charged on this future grid that's provided mostly by renewables, you'd be looking at a car which had the carbon pollution equivalent to something like 500 miles a gallon. So, I think that's the reason, the potential to couple a clean grid and an efficient electric vehicle, is really the motivation behind why we put so much emphasis on electric vehicles. And so electric vehicles are important, but they're not the only thing. We also want to talk about biofuels, which have a significant role to play as we move forward. Now, the importance of biofuels in our fuel system has been growing significantly over the last few years, especially the last decade. The use of biofuels has grown dramatically by more than 500,000 barrels a day. And if we kind of put this in the context of the goals that we're trying to achieve in our Half the Oil plan, we're looking to get another 1.5 million barrels of oil displacement from biofuels. And so I think it's clear that the kind of progress we've made is what we need to see to get to that goal. And something that I think is really significant about this is that this has been a goal to use more biofuels and less oil. It's been something that presidents back since Jimmy Carter have been working on. And without always seeing a lot of traction. And so just in the last few years, we really have started to see biofuels start to play a very significant role in our fuel system. And that's important, to kind of keep building on that progress. However, just because we've made some progress doesn't mean that the path forward is to keep doing more of what we have done. Much like with the electricity grid. And the reason for that is that the biofuels that we're using today are principally made out of corn ethanol, and to a lesser extent, biodiesel made from vegetable oil, particularly soybean oil. And right now, with the growth of biofuel consumption, this is now up to about 40% of the U.S. corn crop going to biofuel production, and about 30% of all the soybean oil produced in the U.S. is going to make biodiesel. There's two problems with this. One is just, the scalability. If we've recently grown 500,000 barrels of oil, and, I think people are well aware of the kind of concern from other users of corn and other sources, how are we going to just keep going for another 1.5 million barrels? It's just not enough corn and soybeans to do that. So the scalability isn't there. And if we tried, a lot of the negative consequences of these crops come into bear. So corn in particular is a pretty hard crop on the environment. Intensive corn farming is responsible for a lot of water pollution, for erosion in the United States. And globally, the expansion of agriculture on a business as usual basis is pushing agriculture into the tropics at the expense of forests. And when that happens, one of the consequences is enormous emissions of carbon released from these forests, and that carbon really gets into the atmosphere and undermines the benefits. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to take carbon out of our fuel in the U.S. as a consequence of putting carbon into the atmosphere in the tropics. And so if we want to keep moving forward with biofuels, we're going to need to look to different sources of biofuels. Things like agricultural residues, these are corn stalks called corn stover, or environmentally friendly energy crops like perennial grasses here, or using waste as a source of fuel. And so, this could be using tree trimmings to make ethanol. This could be using waste cooking oil to make biodiesel, or using landfill gas captured at a landfill to power natural gas-powered vehicles like the trash trucks. And so, we already have today, garbage trucks delivering garbage to a landfill, and then that landfill is producing methane that's powering those garbage trucks. And so, that's obviously makes a lot of sense. And so, in terms of scale, when we think about the opportunity to produce fuel, not from these food crops, but from these biomass sources, the opportunity is really quite large. And we've done an analysis of how can we scale up the production of biomass in a way that protects the food system and the environment. And I don't want to go into the numbers in detail, but the point is that there's more than enough biomass to support the whole 1.5 million barrel a day goal we've got in our half the oil plant. And so the scale of biomass availability is not a constraint, but of course we also need facilities to turn that biomass into transportation fuel, and the first 2 of those have been built, and 3 more are under construction now. And so these are facilities in Iowa and Kansas, Florida and Mississippi, all over the country, new technology, new facilities to make biomass into fuel. So I want to say, before I wrap up on biofuels, I want to say a few words about the carbon emissions associated with biofuels, which is an important part of the story. Today's biofuel, often today's ethanol in particular is generally considered to be, by some people, a little bit cleaner than gasoline, and then there are those who think, maybe ethanol is actually a little bit dirtier than today's gasoline. And I actually don't think this is a particularly useful way to approach this question. And that's because this question, is today's ethanol a little better or a little worse than gasoline, suggests that the decision that we have to make is sort of a yes/no decision. Should we pursue biofuels or not? Or should we pursue gasoline? And that's really not where we are today. Today, the gasoline that we buy in gas stations is about 10% ethanol, and by all accounts, that's not going to change. Ethanol is a part of our fuel system, and the biofuel markets are a part of our agricultural system. So the real question that's before us now is, what are we going to do going forward? And when we think about that, I think it actually makes more sense to compare the biofuels of the future to the biofuels that we have today. And so the largest source of biofuel we have today is it's corn ethanol produced using natural gas as a source of heat. But that's not where all the biofuel comes from. Some of the biofuel is still produced using coal as a source of heat. And when that's done, of course, the emissions are significantly higher. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense. But there's also the opportunities in place today and potential to grow to use cleaner sources of energy to make the same fuel, using biogas, for example, using combined heat and power systems to get more out of the energy inputs. And so when you do this, you can make the same fuel considerably cleaner. The other factor we talked about is food-based fuels, right? And I talked about the scalability, the availability of the resources to make fuel out of food being limited compared to biomass. But the other thing is that, if we make fuels out of wastes instead of food crops, then we don't have to grow more food crops. And so all those agricultural inputs, all the land that's needed, all of those emissions associated with those processes are reduced. And so that reduces the emissions of the fuel as well. And likewise, depending on how the crops to make biofuels are grown, can make a big difference as well. There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of weeks about, a paper evaluating, what would happen if using agricultural residues to make biofuels dramatically reduced the soil carbon, the kind of unsustainable kind of farming that reduced the carbon stored in the soil. And of course, that would reduce or even that would significantly reduce the benefits of producing a biofuel that way. But on the other hand, there are opportunities to do better than the status quo as well. And so whether it's incorporating cover crops into the rotation with today's crops, or using better crops like perennial grasses that actually build considerable soil carbon as the fuel is produced, these are opportunities to enhance the agricultural environment, but also to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel that's produced. And so if we think about all of these opportunities together, moving to biomass-based feedstocks, building soil carbon, processing the biomass into fuel efficiently, and doing it at the same time producing high-value co-products, whether it's renewable electricity or other animal feed products. Doing all of these things, we can make the biofuels of the future substantially cleaner than the biofuels we have today. And when we're doing that, of course, this whole conversation about are biofuels a little better or a little worse than gasoline is really besides the point. And that's especially true because gasoline is getting dirtier, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So just to wrap up, biofuels are an important part of our fuel system today, and they have the potential to grow considerably. And if we're smart about the choices we make, just as is the situation for electric vehicles, right? If we make the biofuels out of the best sources, we can see significant carbon reductions together with significant oil use reductions. And so that's what we need to do going forward. So I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about oil. Of course, there's a lot of talk these days about this new oil boom. And when they talk about the oil boom, I always think about Jed Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies kind of accidentally striking oil on his land while he was hunting, or kind of more realistically, slightly, the Spindletop, the great Texas oil discovery that kind of kicked off the Texas oil boom a century ago. But the fact is that these are not the kinds of resources that are coming online today. Today, the new oil coming online in Texas, so-called tight oil, is sort of trapped with natural gas in the pores of these rocks. And to get this oil out requires this new technology, horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing. And when the oil comes out, it comes out with a great deal of natural gas. And in some cases, the natural gas isn't even used, isn't even marketed, it's just burned on site in what's called flaring. And all of this means that the technology to do this and the flaring, means that this fuel is dirtier and more expensive. And sort of most fundamentally, I think these are important technologies, and there's no doubt they're changing the global economics of oil. But they're not the kind of technologies that that we often think about when we think about technological breakthroughs and progress. Perhaps I used to make computer chips before I got involved in biofuels and public policy. And, I think we all think about the computer business as a business where we invest a lot of money in research and development and develop new technologies. And those new technologies bring us, better products at lower prices, right? And that's what we think about technology doing. And nothing epitomizes that more than my phone. I bought this phone for less than $400, and if I compare it to the first computer I bought about 30 years ago when I went away to college, this Mac 512E, that computer cost about $2,000, more than $5,000 in today's dollars. So more than 10 times as much money, and it got me a machine which was less than one. My new phone is more than 1,000 times more powerful than this computer. And so, that's 10,000-fold improvement over the course of 30 years. And so that's what we think about with technology. But the fact is, when we think about this tight oil technology, tight oil is clearly, these are the words of Professor James Hamilton at the University of California, San Diego. Tight oil is clearly a much inferior source of energy compared to the days when we could just drill a few hundred feet into the earth and the oil would come gushing out. So, this tight oil is dirtier and it's more expensive. And it's not only the tight oil. This is extra heavy crude. This is crude oil that's the viscosity of peanut butter or molasses. And to get this stuff out of the ground requires a lot of extra heat or chemicals, heat in the form of steam, other kinds of chemicals and energy to kind of push this stuff out of the ground. And when you get it out of the ground, you need to do more processing at the refinery to make it into fuel. And then, of course, there's the tar sands. This is a kind of source of fossil fuel that has to be mined like coal. And then when it comes out of the ground, it's mixed together with sand and clay. And so then that needs to be separated, and there's a great deal of processing to upgrade this into usable fuel. And so again, this is a fuel that's dirtier and more expensive than the oil that we have been relying on. But these changes are not things that we see, when we go to fill up our car, right? You don't go to the gas station and decide whether you want the Eagle Ford shale or the tar sands from Alberta, Canada. If we want to understand how our oil is changing, we need to look upstream to the source of oil extraction and the transportation, the refining, and the use of the fuel. And this is what's called the full life cycle emissions of the fuel, and it's what we've already been talking about in the context of biofuels and electricity. But if we think about the life cycle, how the life cycle of oil is changing, and take, for example, tight oil. And so this tight oil, with all of the natural gas coming off and just being burned in place, has considerably higher emissions, per mile of travel than the oil that we have been using. So it's getting worse. There are some opportunities to reduce this problem, to reduce the extent of flaring by actually capturing and using this natural gas. And when we do this, we can clean up this process slightly, but make no mistake, this oil is never going to be a clean fuel, but we can limit how much dirtier it gets. Likewise with the extra heavy crude, using enhanced oil recovery, from thermal enhanced oil recovery, that means pumping steam into the ground. That takes a lot of extra energy to produce the steam and to upgrade the fuel. And so again, there's opportunities to do a little better. For example, using solar thermal enhanced oil recovery, and so that means using the heat from the sun, collecting that with mirrors, using that to generate the steam that's used to get this oil. And doing that, we can mitigate to some extent the extra energy associated with this source of oil. And likewise with